Final Fantasy VII is a turnkey entry in the history of gaming. With an iconic cast of characters, complex story, and the series' first use of 3D graphics, Final Fantasy VII was a massive success when it was released on the PlayStation in 1997. I first beat Final Fantasy VII in 2002, and now having beaten it again in 2022, I was struck by how 20 years had shaped my enjoyment of the game and how different aspects resonated with me. While no doubt a factor of my own changing maturity and life experiences, the game still made me pause and think about just why Final Fantasy VII has had such a wide and timeless appeal. A thought I'd like to explore now that the credits have rolled. From the opening moment of the game, there is something undeniably cool about Final Fantasy VII. Our protagonist, Cloud Strife, is tough, steady under pressure, and wielding a giant sword with a body type in defiance of the action heroes of the late 90s. Quickly enough, Cloud is joined by the bombastic Barret with his fake cursing and so tough it's funny attitude, and the sexy Tifa who can just as easily punch an enemy's face in as serve Cloud a drink. This trio is joined throughout the game by an expanding cast that are all bursting with personality in their own way. Ultimately, Final Fantasy VII had characters unlike anything my younger self had experienced on earlier console generations, or even on my N64. Like a top-tier Marvel movie, these characters drove the game and overcame any deficiencies I experienced as a kid with regards to understanding the often confusing, and at times mistranslated, story. This was further assisted by the range of locales, whether the overstimulating lights and music of the Golden Saucer, or an eerie calm of the City of Ancients. There was a scope in the world of Final Fantasy VII far beyond water world and desert level of other games. Let's also not forget the visuals and graphics of the game. While the overall graphics have definitely not aged well, the graphics engine used during the combat remains impressive. I've long thought that one reason Square made sure the combat of Final Fantasy VII had superior graphics was because of how much of an opportunity it afforded. Massive dragons, complex robots, and an evil house all come about with fully formed actions like we'd never seen. Waging battle with a demonstration in graphical fidelity unlike anything I had seen. All this topped off by the key aspect of the battle that always made my younger heart race: the filled limit break. Dishing out a Clem Hazard from Cloud or pulling up Tifa's roulette wheel was an exercise in pure power fantasy, as Cloud and company offered up an impressive visual flair and a healthy dose of damage. These characters, the visuals, and the combat all ensured that my younger self carried through the game despite a lack of understanding of the game's greater systems, or the complex story, or the villains really decided Sephiroth was bad, so let's stop him. Looking back at what appealed to me most in Final Fantasy VII during my first playthrough, it's safe to say they were somewhat shallow. In fact, as the years went by, despite still thinking of the game fondly, I debated whether or not it really deserved the pedestal it's been placed on. My second playthrough would resolve those doubts, but not in how I expected it to. The aspects of the characters I had honed in on during my first playthrough were now cringy, and almost embarrassing to my adult self. Barret is a stereotype in a bad way, especially early on. Tifa's character is inconsistent, and let's not even talk about Sid, his relationships. And Cloud, our hero, he alternates between being a cliche tough guy and whining way too much. Yet, with their base personalities and stereotypes revealed, the ways in which the characters did deviate jumped out. This is most obvious with Aerith, originally the sweet girl who I was angry at Sephiroth for killing. She instead became the heart of the game in my second playthrough. Optimistic and hopeful in the face of everything, she is the driving force behind the game's entire third act. Other characters benefit as well. Barret's tough attitude became more obvious in act, hiding his own fears in the terrible world he lives in for the sake of his daughter. No doubt these perceptions were assisted by my recent playthrough of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but while they may have been enhanced in Remake, they were clearly there all along in the original. What was more surprising though was how many of Final Fantasy VII's themes and storylines, now they had the age and life experience to follow them, seem somehow more relevant today than when the game was released. Mega corporations ruling the planet and energy consumption killing it were no doubt concerns in the late 90s, but not to the level they are today. The one that struck me though the most was Cloud's own struggles. Once past his cliche introduction, we have a character ultimately struggling with identity of who he is in the world. Final Fantasy VII can be summed up as Cloud's quest to break free of the controls that have been put upon him, whether by his dreams, by the Shinra, or by his friends, and instead to find his place in the world and fight for his right to do so. His insistence near the end of the game that the members of the party go and find what they are fighting for is very much proof that he has found who he is. No doubt, one of the greater disappointments of life as I've entered adulthood is realizing all the little burdens and expectations that society places on you that end up controlling your actions in a way that feels like a lesser form of Sephiroth's subconscious control over Cloud. It's this depth in Final Fantasy VII that finally made me understand why it is timeless. Some games are indeed great, but once beaten, leave the player with little or no inclination to go and revisit them, even in a proverbial world where we had the time. This is not a huge knock against simply great games. They are still quite an accomplishment, and they often achieve this by doing one or a small number of aspects very well. We need games that are focused and, for lack of a better phrase, simple in the same way that you need to watch a rom-com every so often by an endless stream of historical epics. What Final Fantasy VII achieved was to contain a story and world with considerable maturity and appeal to an older player and one that a younger audience would also enjoy. It did this with a veneer of cool and tough characters and a flashy battle system that ensured a younger audience would remain engaged even if they wouldn't see the depths of the story and setting, or even understand them. These combined made for a game that would draw in a younger audience, but contain more for an older player who could bring greater life experience to their interpretation. Much like a good book that has something for its reader every time they return, depending upon where they are in life, Final Fantasy VII's wide-ranging story and varied cast meant that a player will always be able to find something that will resonate with them, and that's why Final Fantasy VII will always remain a timeless entry in the history of gaming. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed this video and watching Katie and I play through Final Fantasy VII together. It was really striking to play such a complex game so many years apart. It was interesting for me to realize how much I've changed over years through my perception of a game, and it makes me wonder if one reason we've had so many strong narrative games over the last decade or so is a result of those who grew up playing games like Final Fantasy VII entering the gaming industry. If you played a game that had a similar experience, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this, please hit those like and subscribe buttons. I've got 30 parts of my wife and I playing through Final Fantasy VII that I'm sure you'd enjoy. Anyways, I'm going to try to get back to it, but as always, I am never free to play.